Happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for tuning into Business Daily. I'm Lee Ji-yoon in Seoul. Before we get started, let's first get a quick glimpse of today's highlights. Korean films are dominating box offices these days as more moviegoers here in the country prefer to sit down for locally made films instead of Hollywood hits. From the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2016 to the official launch of the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we dive into some of the global business stories that made headlines this week. Over in Davos, where this year's World Economic Forum is currently underway, plunging global oil prices and China's slowing growth have been dominating talks among global leaders. Our Hwan Da-eun has the details.
World business leaders voiced concerns over current global economic woes, indicating a grim outlook for the future. Their main concerns? The continuing drop in oil prices and China's slowing growth.
Drop of oil prices, Chinese slowing down, tightening liquidities of the banks, all affecting, I believe, the economy. I hope the picture will look brighter as we go on in the year, but for the moment it doesn't look bright.
Hussein al-Nouais from the United Arab Emirates added that with the entry of Iran, global oil prices will be affected even more, sparking further volatility in global stock markets. Christopher Pissarides of the London School of Economics echoed the view, saying that although sporadic rebounds are expected, record low oil prices will remain for quite some time. Expressing concerns over China's economic slump, economists suggested the Chinese government implement more transparent economic policies and further accelerate economic reforms. Some, however, were optimistic, expressing confidence in the strength of the current state of the world's economy.
There are some concerns about the Chinese financial structure, banking structure and so on, but I think if you look in the world generally, the strength, the financial strength of the financial institutions is strong, much stronger than it was, say, 7-10 years ago.
For some European leaders, the fight against terrorism topped the agenda.
So we all discuss the best way to fight terrorism with military means and on the diplomatic level, but also on the internet. I will meet with delegates from Facebook shortly.
The UK's EU referendum to leave the European Union, or Brexit, also took center stage, with French Prime Minister Manuel Valls saying it would be a tragedy triggering disastrous consequences at a time when the EU needs to stick together the most. Hwan Da-eun, Business Daily.
And staying in Davos, one of the perks of attending such a global event is the chance to enjoy some world-class food, entertainment, as well as networking opportunities. And on Thursday night local time, it was Korea's chance to shine. Our Kim Min-ji takes us there.
Hundreds of people were able to taste a bit of Korean culture at the Korean Night event. Organized by the Federation of Korean Industries, the event was attended by prominent figures with a guest list including Special Presidential Envoy and Korea's former Finance Chief Choi Kyung-hwan, SK Group Chairman Choi Tae-won, as well as the CEO of Arirang TV Bang Seok-ho. The event, now in its 8th year, was held under the theme K-Culture Connect to the World. In a video message, President Park Geun-hye said Korea is stepping up its role in connecting the world.
The power of culture to bring healing is advancing the cause of human happiness. At a time when borders are eroding, when our world is increasingly becoming a shared community, I look forward to humanity being brought together and connecting through culture.
As the event aims to boost Korea's presence on the global stage, the organizers say the nation's private and public sectors will work together to further promote Korea's brand value. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily, Davos.
The first first export of U.S. crude oil in 4 decades arrived in Europe earlier this week after restrictions on the country's crude exports were lifted. An oil tanker from the U.S. arrived in France on Wednesday, while another tanker carrying American crude is headed for the Netherlands. The oil was received by Vitol Group, the world's largest independent oil trader based in the Netherlands. The most likely destination for the U.S. crude is a refinery in Switzerland. The Financial Times called the news a landmark moment for an industry battling a collapse in oil prices. But this is expected to add to the current supply glut, further bringing down prices already at record lows. Korea's antitrust agency has launched an official investigation into Volkswagen, this time on suspicions that the German automaker misled consumers with false and exaggerated advertisements. The Fair Trade Commission said VW Korea ran deceptive ads claiming its diesel vehicles involved in emissions cheating had met the European Union's strict Euro 5 emission standards. The watchdog said fines of up to 2% of related sales could be levied if these allegations prove to be true. The head of Volkswagen Korea is also currently embroiled in a criminal investigation after submitting an insufficient recall plan to the country's environment ministry. Now, with the weekend ahead of us, a good way to kick back might be going to the movies. In Korea, it's definitely a popular option, as data show that a record number of people hit the theaters last year. Our Lee Joo-young tells us more.
Korea's film industry gave birth to a string of box office hits in 2015. Starting with this movie, Ode to My Father, which attracted over 14 million people, 2 other local action thrillers, Veteran and Assassination, also ended up selling over 10 million tickets. Largely thanks to these blockbuster hits, 63.8% of moviegoers sat down to watch Korean films last year as opposed to foreign films, reflecting the growing appetite for local motion pictures that has been on the rise since 2011. The overall number of moviegoers also surged. According to the country's box office tracker Korean Film Council, a record 215 million tickets were snatched up last year, over 114,000 more than the previous year. That comes down to roughly 4.2 movies watched per person, the highest in the world.
Koreans watch a lot of movies to relieve stress amid difficult times, and going to the cinema is one of the easiest ways to enjoy culture.
While the country's box office has achieved new heights in terms of moviegoers and ticket sales, Korea Institute for Film and Media Content Industry says there are still a lot of obstacles that lie ahead. The oligopoly conglomerates have over investment and distribution are cited as one of the main problems, and the institute also says the film industry needs to look beyond the already saturated local market and pave the way for further expansion abroad. Lee Joo-young, Business Daily.
It's Friday, and that means it's time to look through some of the global business stories that made headlines this week. And for that, we're now joined by our Eunice Kim in the studio. Hello, Eunice.
Hello, June.
So the World Economic Forum is in full force in Davos, Switzerland. And like we mentioned earlier in our newscast, we heard about some of the discussions that are taking place there. Right. And of course, China's slowing growth as well as plunging oil prices led the headlines. But I hear that the top risks identified by the WEF was something quite different.
Right, so risks and fear have been really driving this very volatile market we've been seeing at the start of this year. And the World Economic Forum did issue a report ahead of this 4-day round of meetings, and it pointed to environmental factors as the biggest risk the world is facing in a decidedly more wide view approach. Take a look.
Markets were heaving a sigh of relief at this end week as falling oil prices extended their upswing, and the European Central Bank overnight indicated it stood ready to inject more stimulus in March, should that be judged necessary.
The answer, as far as our monetary policy is concerned, when these market developments in this heightened volatility in financial and commodity markets translates where to persist longer than in the short run may well become a factor, an unwanted tightening of the financing conditions, and therefore that's one of the reasons why, as I read before, we will review and possibly reconsider our monetary policy stance in March.
The pronounced market fluctuations are becoming a factor for central bankers as they threaten to derail the sentiment they need to boost growth and inflation. But take a wider, more long-term look, and the World Economic Forum says environmental risks top them all. In its annual Global Risks Report, the Swiss nonprofit had 750 experts examine 29 different risk areas. And the result was this. Over the next 10 years, the failure to stop climate change and related food and water crises would have the largest impact in the coming so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, beating out others like energy price shock, data theft, and fiscal crises to make up most of the top 5 for the first time. And we're already seeing such social instability that leaders say is only the tip of the iceberg.
We have problems today in Europe because of some hundreds of thousands of people migrating. But if it is a question of thousands of millions of people, what will happen? And at the end of the day, it's a question of war and peace. And I think this agreement is a major pillar for security.
The French foreign minister was joined by United Nations Chief Ban Ki-moon in the call for countries to swiftly adopt and implement last month's historical Paris climate change agreement or face a much intensified trend of migration and uncertainties as even greater throngs of people seek safer and more economically viable lands.
You know, I think it's really interesting that amid all the things that are happening in the business world, the biggest risk named by the WEF was actually climate related.
Right.
So what do business leaders think about this?
Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, climate did not top the concerns of business leaders. PricewaterhouseCoopers, in fact, did conduct a survey on CEOs' business priorities this year, and it didn't even make the survey. The results were published at Davos, and the 1,400 CEOs who took part said government overregulation and geopolitical uncertainty were their biggest concerns at 79% and 74% respectively. Perhaps environmental concerns, though, go hand in hand with that over-regulation option in the sense that businesses find themselves facing a growing list of rules they must adhere to due to the global drive to curb a warming Earth.
Now, on that note, one of the sectors taking heat in this global economic downturn are banks. And we heard yesterday that UK bank Barclays is actually pulling out of Korea.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this seems to be part of a growing trend we're seeing in global banks as the world's largest banks are cutting costs to balance out a shrinking profit margin. Now, Barclays announced on Thursday it will cut about 1,200 jobs, most of them in investment banking in Asia. And the UK bank will close its offices not only in Korea, but also Australia, Taiwan, and Southeast Asian nations like Indonesia and the Philippines. This completes the downsizing of jobs the bank had pledged to carry out in 2014 when it said it would cut 19,000 jobs, 7,000 of them in investment banking. Meanwhile, Morgan Stanley this week said it was poised to move jobs out of Wall Street to more economical cities like India's Mumbai and Hungary's Budapest as it aims to shed $1 billion in costs. The investment bank beat fourth quarter forecasts this week, thanks in part to such aggressive cost-cutting moves. And finally, it's open for operation. On Saturday, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank held its formal inauguration ceremony with 57 countries signed on as founding members. China holds veto rights and 26% of the bank's voting rights, with a 30% contribution to the bank's planned $100 billion in capital. This as China's leader, Xi Jinping, is in the Middle East this week, a region still very tense after the execution of a prominent Shiite cleric in Saudi Arabia led to fractured diplomatic relations there. On this Friday, President Xi will be one of the first world leaders to visit Iran, now free of nuclear sanctions. Now, this follows his state visits to Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where China inked business deals worth billions of dollars.
And also considering that Korea is the fifth largest stakeholder of AIIB, I'm sure that there are growing expectations that there will be more opportunities in the region for Korean businesses as well.
We'll have to wait and see.
All right, thank you so much for coming in today, Eunice.
You bet.
And that wraps it up for today and this week. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll be back next week with more right here on Arirang, so don't forget to tune in then. Have a great weekend.